Hello everyone, my name is Dia Beggs. I am a student in Global Environmental Health in fall 2019, and I am here to tell the story of the asbestos disaster in Libby, Montana. Libby is the site of one of the worst environmental disasters in U.S. history. The residents and workers of Libby were exposed to large amounts of asbestos from nearby mines, and this asbestos killed hundreds of people, sickened thousands, and also led to an expensive and complicated mass cleanup project. The objective of this presentation is to remember and learn from the asbestos events in Libby, Montana, especially since many of these events could have been prevented. I will be going over the history of Libby, which I will demonstrate through various graphs, tables, and maps. I will be talking about the mortality effects of asbestos, exposure pathways, the time lag between exposure and mortality, the persistence of asbestos in the area despite cleanup efforts, and the transportation of tainted minerals from Libby across the U.S. Mining activities began in Libby in 1919 with the mining of vermiculite, also known commercially as zonolite. Zonolite was sold for construction purposes, like insulation for homes and buildings. It would later become clear that the vermiculite was contaminated with asbestos. In 1963, a company called W.R. Grace & Company purchased the mines. Even though they knew about the asbestos and its effects on workers and residents, they did not halt mining or take any precautions or care to warn anyone about the dangers. The company claimed that they were unaware of the hazards despite the fact that many workers had developed lung problems, and despite the fact that the health effects of asbestos were becoming well known. The mine closed in 1990, but the detrimental effects on Libby did not gain national attention until 1999, when reporters broke the story in a series of articles called Uncivil Action, A Town Left to Die. Following this, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency stepped in with a mass cleanup project, one of the biggest cleanup projects in EPA history. W.R. Grace was ordered to provide $250 million to cover up cleanup costs, but the total cleanup has been estimated around $600 million. This also does not account for the preventable loss of life and harm to innocent residents. So what exactly were the health effects of asbestos on workers? Asbestos is most dangerous when inhaled, so most of the health effects were lung damage, such as lung cancer and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. As you can see on this bar graph, out of a sample of 1,871 workers, 111 died from lung cancer, 71 from COPD, 18 from mesothelioma, 15 from intestinal or colorectal cancer, and another 2 from laryngeal cancer. This sample does not capture everything, but it shows the most common mortality risks for asbestos-exposed workers. It also does not include the affected Libby residents who did not work at the mines. Asbestos affected many different aspects of life in Libby, and not just for the workers. W.R. Grace distributed their extra vermiculite for the residents to use in gardens, backyards, roads, playgrounds, and even the baseball field. So it was really everywhere. This table is from a study that asked over 7,000 residents about different means of exposure. Recreational activities were the most common pathways of exposure, with 67% of residents reporting participating in recreational activities along the road that leads up to the mine, and 66% reported playing at the contaminated baseball field. Other significant pathways included using vermiculite for gardening, attic insulation, as well as heating vermiculite to make it expand, playing in vermiculite piles, and using vermiculite around the home, and other activities. Since there were so many different means of exposure, this only complicated the eventual cleanup. There is very significant lag in the time between exposure to asbestos and the health effect. This could partially explain why the EPA and other health agencies were so slow to respond to the disaster in Libby, though this is no excuse. People were getting sick for a long time before the EPA stepped in. This graph shows the increase in lung cancer mortality risk over the passage of time. In the first 15 years after asbestos exposure, the death rate from lung cancer per year in these workers is 0.03%, which is kind of similar to the current lung cancer mortality rate of 0.04%, so a significant difference probably would not have been noticed. Then after 15 years, the rate creeps up to 0.13%. At 25 years, it almost doubles to 0.25%, which is much higher than is normal. After 35 years, the rate stays high at 0.26%. Because of the slow nature of asbestos effects on the lungs, the exposure was allowed to go on for many years. If asbestos had an immediate effect, then the mines probably would have been shut down much faster and fewer people would have been exposed. This demonstrates why companies and government agencies cannot wait for a health effect to occur in order to take action. By this time, it is too late for many people. When the EPA finally stepped in and launched its mass cleanup effort in 1999, I can't imagine that they knew what they were in for. The cleanup project was more complicated and expensive than anyone had foreseen. The EPA had to investigate more than 8,000 properties, and they removed asbestos from 2,600 sites, both private and public. Removing asbestos is a dangerous and hazardous job to take on. This slide shows just how complicated the process can be. After years of asbestos dust in the air around the mines, harmful amphibial fibers settled into the trees in the surrounding forests. As you can see, the closer the location to the mine, the more asbestos in the tree bark. The EPA then had to grapple with how to manage these now hazardous trees. If residents use the wood for heating or cooking, then this poses a health risk to residents. If the EPA or logging companies cut down the trees, then the asbestos dust could be released into the air. If there is a forest fire, then this could pose an enormous hazard. It is a complicated matter, and the forest will probably hold the asbestos for decades to come. Unfortunately, the disaster in Libby was not just contained to Libby. W.R. Grace did not only pollute Libby, but the company shipped its contaminated materials all across the nation. Just think about. For each of these dots on this map, asbestos was loaded onto a rail car and spread nationwide. Each of these dots provided an opportunity for exposure by the workers who load the mineral, the railway workers and riders who breathe the air, the workers who transport the mineral from car to car, those who unload it, and those who manage it at the destination site. In each of these instances, the business dealings of W.R. Grace put many people at risk nationwide. Given everything that we know about W.R. Grace and Company, the $250 million seems a small price to pay for the asbestos disaster in Libby, Montana. Just to recap the story, the mines opened in 1919 and were bought by Grace in 1963. To date, around 400 Libby residents have died from asbestos exposure, and nearly 3,000 others have suffered from asbestos-related illnesses. Grace closed the mines about 10 years before the problem really received any attention, after the media exposed the story in 1999. Ever since, the EPA has been engaged in a mass cleanup project, perhaps the biggest in American history. Thousands of Libby residents and Grace workers have sued the state for a failure to warn them about the dangers of asbestos in the mine. In 2011, the state settled for $43 million for the residents affected, and in 2017, more plaintiffs were given a $25 million settlement, though many Libby residents would say that this was too little, too late. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have learned something interesting and useful from this presentation on the asbestos disaster in Libby, Montana.